Welcome to Movies. Today we are looking into the films Back to the Future and Forrest Gump and how they compare and contrast each other.
Hey everyone, and welcome. I've lost count of how many times I've watched Back to the Future and Forrest Gump and thought, man, I wish I had a time machine. And today, that's exactly what we're doing, diving deep into the making of these iconic films.
We've got a lot to unpack, too. We'll be taking a look at excerpts from Wikipedia articles about both films, getting into those behind-the-scenes stories, the critical reception, and, kind of their lasting legacies.
Okay, let's unpack this, because there's some pretty fascinating stuff here, right? Surprising casting choices, special effects before CGI was everywhere, and even how real-world events, actually influence these stories.
It's wild to think about how these films, made a whole decade apart, explore our relationship with time in such different ways, Back to the Future gives us that literal time machine. But then Forrest Gump uses the passage of time to tell a much larger story about fate, about choices, even about, the American experience.
Back to the Future. But this pop culture phenomenon almost didn't get made. The script was rejected over 40 times. Over 40!
Over 40 rejections, it's true. Talk about perseverance, right? The filmmakers really believed in this story, but studios, they just weren't sold on time travel. It was like box office poison back then. Some even thought the story was too tame, especially compared to those racy comedies that were huge in the early 80s.
I mean, how times have changed. Even Disney thought it was a bit edgy back in the day.
It's true. They were worried about Marty's interactions with his mom. Can you imagine? Back to the Future, too spicy for Disney. But you know what? Those rejections, as strange as it sounds, they actually helped make the film what it is.
I've never thought about it like that. How so?
Well, all those rewrites, they forced the writers, Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, to really emphasize the humor and the heart. They knew they had to convince these studios that it wasn't just another wacky time travel flick. It was about family. It was about second chances. Even that whole timeless struggle of fitting in.
Which is something we can all relate to, right?
Yeah.
But it could have been a very different movie. Didn't they want to change the title to something completely ridiculous?
Oh, are you talking about Spaceman from Pluto? Yeah, that almost happened.
Spaceman from Pluto. Who on earth thought that was a good idea?
Thankfully, Spielberg stepped in. You used his influence to keep that iconic title we know and love.
Dodged a bullet there.
Yeah.
But Spielberg's involvement wasn't just about his name, was it? I mean, the guy knows how to make a movie.
Exactly. His experience, his clout in Hollywood, that was crucial for Zemeckis and Gale to actually make the film they wanted on their own terms. Spielberg, he understood their vision and fought for it.
And you can't talk about vision without mentioning the whole Michael J. Fox casting, saga, really. It's almost as legendary as the film itself. The guy wasn't even the first choice for Marty McFly. Kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, it's true. Eric Stoltz was actually cast as Marty initially. They even filmed with him for several weeks, but they realized something just wasn't quite clicking.
What happened? Was it his performance?
Stoltz, he's a fantastic actor, don't get me wrong, but his style, it was just a different fit for Marty. He brought a certain intensity, almost like a dramatic flair, that didn't quite gel with the comedic energy Zemeckis wanted. They needed someone who could do both, The awkward teenager and the, charismatic hero.
So they decided to make a change. That must have been a tough call, right? I mean, recasting your lead so far into production.
Oh, huge gamble. But they knew what they wanted, and Michael J. Fox, he was, perfect for it. Problem was, he was already committed to Family Ties.
Talk about a scheduling nightmare.
Total nightmare. They had to rework the entire shooting schedule. Fox was playing double duty, finishing up Family Ties, grabbing maybe a few hours of sleep, then straight to Back to the Future.
Wow. Dedication. I even heard they shot some scenes without him there because he was so booked.
They did. Stand-ins, clever camera angles, anything to work around his schedule. Amazing, though, how he managed both and still delivered such an iconic performance.
Absolutely. Try to imagine anyone else as Marty McFly now, I dare you. Okay, we can't talk about Back to the Future without the special effects. This was 1985, long before CGI took over Hollywood.
I know, right? Industrial Light and Magic, led by Ken Ralston, they worked magic with practical effects, really pushing boundaries, that lightning strike. The one that sends Marty back to 1985. A miniature. They built this huge model of the clock tower, rigged it with lights to get the effect of the bolt hitting just right.
So cool. It's amazing what they could do back then. Those practical effects give the film such a realness, a grittiness you don't get with CGI.
It's true. And it wasn't just miniatures. They used forced perspective, matte paintings, even this thing called optical compositing, all to make Zemeckis' vision a reality.
And the DeLorean. That car is a character in itself.
Totally. With the gull-wing doors, the sleek, kind of futuristic for the 80s design, it became like the symbol of time travel. And, they almost went with a totally different ending.
No way. What was it going to be?
They wanted this big climax with the DeLorean driving into a nuclear explosion.
Whoa, seriously?
Budget cuts, though. They had to get creative, and that's how we got the iconic clock tower sequence instead.
Wow. It's funny how limitations can sometimes lead to even better choices. I can't imagine a better ending. Okay, before we move on to Forrest Gump, what about the impact of Back to the Future? Huge, right?
Oh, massive. It was the highest grossing film of 1985, and that was not a good year for Hollywood in general.
What do you think it connected with people so much?
I think it was that escapism, The 80s, for all the cool stuff, it was a time of anxiety, kind of like today. People wanted a fun, lighthearted adventure, and Back to the Future delivered. But it's got heart, too.
More than just a time travel movie, for sure.
Exactly. At its core, it's about family, about second chances, about staying true to who you are. Marty's journey, it resonates because we all want that, right? To set things right, maybe even become a better version of ourselves along the way.
Okay, let's switch gears now to another cinematic masterpiece that, while it doesn't have a DeLorean, takes us on a journey through time in its own unique way. Forrest Gump. Not your typical time travel flick, but it does take us on a whirlwind tour through some of the most defining moments in American history, from the 50s to the early 80s.
And right there in the middle of it all is Forrest, this simple, kind-hearted guy who somehow keeps finding himself at the heart of these huge events. It's about fate, destiny, even the power of one person to impact the world around them. Though, funny thing is, the studio wasn't so sure about it at first.
Really? They were hesitant about Forrest Gump. Hard to imagine that now.
It's true. The executives, they weren't sure audiences would connect with something so, quirky, unconventional.
So what changed their minds?
Casting, mostly. Tom Hanks as Forrest, that was genius. But even he wasn't the first choice, believe it or not.
Wait, seriously? Who else were they considering?
John Travolta. Can you imagine?
Whoa. It's really hard to picture anyone else as Forrest now.
Right. And Travolta himself has said passing on Forrest Gump was one of his biggest regrets.
I bet. Hanks brought this earnestness, this vulnerability to the role. Forrest could easily been a caricature, but he made him relatable, human. And you can't forget Robin Wright as Jenny either. Such a complex, heartbreaking role.
Oh, absolutely. Jenny's journey, it's so intertwined with Forrest, but it also provides this stark contrast to his experiences. She represents a whole generation grappling with social change, trying to find meaning in a really turbulent time.
Her story definitely got people talking, right? Was she someone to sympathize with, a victim of circumstance, or someone who made reckless choices? It's still debated today.
Exactly. And that's a testament to Robin Wright's performance, that Jenny remains such a fascinating and complex character. She can't be easily defined, and her story adds another whole layer to the film's exploration of fate, choice, and just the complexities of relationships.
And speaking of things that spark debate, what about that feather? The one that just floats through the air at the beginning and end of the film. What's the deal with that?
Ah, the feather. One of those cinematic elements that's inspired endless interpretations and discussions, right? Is it fate? Our lives are predetermined, just like that feather's path. Or maybe it's chance, saying life is unpredictable. We're all just floating along.
It's like a Rorschach test. You see what you want to see. Some people find it deeply meaningful. Others find it just plain confusing.
Exactly. That's part of its brilliance. It doesn't give you easy answers. It makes you think about life's mysteries, the forces that shape our destinies, the choices we make.
It definitely adds to the mystery and symbolism to a film already full of twists and turns.
It's funny, isn't it, how both films kind of grapple with this idea of unintended consequences.
Oh, totally. It's a staple of time travel stories, right? Mess with the past, there's always a price to pay. Even those tiny changes Marty makes, they ripple out in ways he could never imagine.
Exactly. He almost wipes himself out of existence just by messing with his parents' first meeting. Shows you how connected things really are, even across time.
And it's not just Marty's own timeline, right? Remember how different Hill Valley is when Biff gets a hold of that sports almanac? Talk about changing the future. One little choice, Suddenly Biff's this big shot tycoon, and Hill Valley's practically a war zone.
It really shows you how these tiny actions can have massive consequences, ones you never see coming. What's interesting about Forrest Gump, though, is that the consequences of his actions are usually, well, good, even though he just kind of stumbles into them, like he's this force of destiny, but in a good way, you know?
It's true. He inspires Elvis's dance moves totally by accident. He exposes Watergate, becomes this ping pong champ, all while just trying to live his life.
Yeah. This unintentional ripple effect, but it makes the world a better place. Kind of a nice contrast to Marty almost destroying the space-time continuum every 5 minutes.
Totally. And you know what else struck me? Both films, they deal with this idea of nostalgia, but in very different ways.
Interesting. How so?
Well, with Back to the Future, it's very specific, right? It's this love letter to the 1950s, like Americana, seen through the eyes of an 80s teenager. The music, the cars, the diners, even how they talk, it's all very deliberate.
Yeah, you're right. It's a bit romanticized, for sure. Presented with this, like, playful, almost cartoonish energy.
Like when Marty plays Johnny Be Good at that school dance, you see how the teenagers react to this music that's brand new to them. But for everyone watching, it's a total blast from the past.
It's playing with our own sense of time, isn't it? How music, how culture changes. But you're right, the nostalgia in Forrest Gump, it's deeper, more complex.
It's not just wanting to go back to a certain time, is it? It's more about longing for this simpler time, especially in American history. Forrest, he starts in the 50s, this era we associate with that, but then he goes to the 60s, the 70s, all this social and political turmoil.
And yet Forrest, he moves through it all with this, like, childlike wonder. He's almost untouched by the cynicism of the time,
Which I think is a big part of why people love the film. We're seeing history through someone who doesn't have all that baggage.
Yeah. Even when he's witnessing these huge, dark moments, the JFK assassination, Vietnam, he still finds joy in the small things, running, ping pong, just being with people he cares about.
Like a reminder that even when things are chaotic, you can still find beauty, connection. You just got to be open to it.
Great.
So we've talked about time travel, unintended consequences, nostalgia. But there's another layer to these films we need to talk about. Both Back to the Future and Forrest Gump, they spark these conversations about race, social justice, particularly in how they show certain historical events, characters.
Yeah, that's important to remember. As entertaining, as thought-provoking as they are, they're products of their time. They reflect certain biases, for sure.
With Back to the Future, it's interesting how they portray Hill Valley in 1955. It's visually beautiful, all those classic cars, the stores, but it's also pretty idealized, don't you think?
Definitely. You don't see the segregation, the racial inequality that was very real in the 50s. Hill Valley is almost sanitized.
Exactly. This nostalgic, perfect version of the past, but not entirely accurate. And then there's Marty playing Johnny Be Good. He's influencing Chuck Berry's style, which, brings up some questions.
It does. Cultural appropriation, the way musical genres evolve, the scene's fun, lighthearted, but it also kind of highlights how Black artists often didn't get the same recognition back then.
Yeah. It reminds us that even in films that aren't directly about race, these themes are still there, whether they meant to or not. And Forrest Gump deals with this too, just in its own way.
Right. As much as the film celebrates Forrest's wins, it tends to simplify some pretty complex things, like the civil rights movement, for instance.
It's like it wants to be optimistic, but it also has to acknowledge these struggles. But in doing that, it might be minimizing what people went through fighting for equality.
Yeah, you have to be careful with that balance. And look, Forrest Gump isn't a documentary, but it's still important to look at how it portrays things, because those events, they had real impact on real people's lives.
So after unpacking all this, it makes you think, right, what's the lasting legacy of these films? How will Back to the Future and Forrest Gump be remembered years from now?
Oh, that's the big question, isn't it? Back to the Future. I think it'll always be loved for the pure entertainment, those images, the lines everyone quotes. It's so ingrained in pop culture, and it'll keep being enjoyed by, generations to come.
It's a classic for a reason, that's for sure.
Exactly. And with Forrest Gump, it might always have those debates about how it portrays history, but it'll also be remembered for the heart, that message of hope.
A film that can make you laugh, make you cry, and make you think all at the same time. That's pretty impressive.
It really is. Both films, in their own ways, they capture something. They stay with you.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. They're fun, heartwarming even, but they also make you look at history differently, like where we fit into it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of thinking differently, both films kind of touch on something we haven't really gotten into yet. The ethics of time travel. It's something people have debated forever, but these movies, they make it feel real.
Let's talk about that. I mean, Marty, he's always middling, but he means well, right?
Right, but even with good intentions, you run into these dilemmas, like when Marty uses what he knows from the future to win that skateboard competition or impress his dad with that punch. Is that really playing fair?
It's a tough one. He's not hurting anyone, and he does use his knowledge to help his family in the end. But it does make you wonder, if someone really could see the future, would they use it for good? Or would it be like total chaos?
Exactly. And then you get into the really deep stuff, like that classic question, if you could go back, would you kill baby Hitler? No easy answers there, just really tough moral choices.
Makes you think, if time travel were real, could we resist messing things up, even if we knew it might cause problems? And it's not just Back to the Future that does this. Forrest Gump has its own moments, even if they're not always presented so directly.
That's what's so clever about it, though. It gets under your skin without being preachy. Take Forrest joining the army, going to Vietnam. A war, by the way, that he doesn't fully grasp.
Yeah, it makes you ask, what's our responsibility when it comes to these big historical events? Forrest is a good guy, but he gets caught up in stuff that's really complicated, morally speaking.
And then there's his relationship with Jenny. Her struggles are so real, so heartbreaking. And as much as Forrest loves her, and it's clearly genuine, it does make you think about consent, about whether he fully understands what she's going through.
It's a credit to the filmmakers that they can take these heavy themes and still make films that are, at their core, about hope, about never giving up.
Exactly. They don't pretend life is easy. There are tough questions, but they also entertain us, make us laugh, sometimes make us cry, and they stick with you long after the credits roll, make you see the world a bit differently.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the biggest takeaway? What do these films tell us about how we see time?
It's funny, but I think both films, in their own way, really highlight how important the present moment is. Back to the Future warns us that messing with the past can blow up in our faces. It's like it's saying, yeah, learn from history, but focus on making the most of right now.
And Forrest Gump seems to be saying, don't worry so much about controlling the future, Just be present, find the good in the everyday stuff, be with the people you care about.
Right. It's that journey, those unexpected twists and turns, that's where the real adventure is. And even without a time machine, our choices, big or small, they matter. They make the future what it's going to be.
What a ride this has been. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this deep dive into Back to the Future and Forrest Gump. Hope you enjoyed all the trivia, the behind-the-scenes stuff, and maybe even had a few, whoa, never thought about that moments along the way.
It's been a pleasure. Always fun to revisit these classics and see what new things we can discover.
And for those listening, here's something to think about as you go about your day. What if the real magic of time travel isn't about changing what happened or seeing what's going to happen, but just appreciating the power we have to make right now? Amazing.
Well said. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and let's keep the magic of movies alive.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Welcome to Science. Welcome to is dedicated to exploring new technology to create informative and entertaining media. If you would like to create a podcast like this, be sure to visit Google Notebook LM. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe for more. Leave a comment if you have an idea for an episode that we should start researching. Thank you for listening.